On this edition of the program, we break down the Pod Save America video. We talk to Ettingermentum and the future of the pro-choice movement. Big old podcast for you. It's all coming up.
The following is brought to you by Just Another Pilot.
Hello and welcome everybody to the Politics program for December 6th, 2024. Your old pal Justin Robert Young. The days, my friends, they're getting shorter, but the podcast, well, it stretches even longer. Much like the long night, the long chilly nights that demand a hot toddy, or maybe even a little glass of bourbon for you. A warm glass of milk for the kids. Settle in, friends, because we got a doozy on your hands. You know, it's on your hands. It's on the tip of your tongue. It's worming its way inside of your brain right now. And we won't delay anymore. Ettingermentum on the show. We talk a lot about the future of the Democratic Party. And, you know, he was a dude who believed there was going to be a favorable environment for Democrats, thought that it was fool's gold to believe public polling that showed Donald Trump leading, and, you know, takes his medicine on it. It's good. I think it's a very good conversation. I think he's a very smart dude who does his research and cites it, which is something that I always appreciate. And then Alice Miranda Ollstein will join the show. She's a reporter for Politico who wrote about the pro-choice movement, how they are picking through the pieces on an election that was supposed to be Roe's revenge. But before we do that, let's talk about the Pod Save America interview. A lot of people have written about it. A lot of people have talked about it. There's been a lot of discussion. I wanted to wait until I could really dig through it one more time after I listened to it so I could bring you guys the best of it. And here's the reason why. Here's why this interview matters. In the world of campaign postmortems, there have, since I've been alive, two ways that you find out the real thoughts of what the people running the campaigns were while they were running them. Magazine articles that happen afterward, and books that come out about a year after the campaign. These are the lifeblood of shows like mine, because I am not a practitioner. I am not in the field. I have not run a campaign, and I've had limited interaction with people as they are running campaigns. I am somebody that has grown up outside of this universe, merely observing it. And so the juiciest, most nutritious tidbits came from those two areas. That was true up until this cycle, because this cycle has been referred to often as the podcast election because of the conversation that went on around Donald Trump's strategy to go on a bunch of non-political podcasts, up to and including Joe Rogan. We'll get to him. But it also has played out on the other side of this. Because before those articles come out, before those books are written, some of the people that will likely get either a lot of praise or criticism are going on podcasts so they can get their version of events out as fast as possible. Now, the reason why any of this happens, by the way, is because this is their phony baloney jobs. They get hired to run campaigns or to be operatives in campaigns. And they get hired from a limited pool for a limited amount of jobs every 2 to 4 years. if you want to remain in good standing, when you have a gigantic public success or failure, you either A, want to make sure that you tie yourself as close as possible to the success, or that you distance yourself as far away from the failure. So the next person who hires you says, yeah, I know stuff went bad with your last job, but I'm pretty sure that was because of right? Whatever narratives you want to get out there. That's the reason why anybody talks about the inner workings of campaigns, because everybody wants to know that the narrative is, well, it really worked because of me. Well, it really didn't work because of not me. And so we have two interviews. I don't have clips from one of them, but I will refer to it. I would encourage everybody to listen to Chris LaCivita. He was on the Trump campaign. He talked to David Axelrod on the Axe Files. I listened to that. And then the big one, the one where everybody wants to listen, is the Harris Walls leadership on Pod Save America. This is comprised of Jen O'Malley Dillon, Stephanie Cutter, Quentin Fawkes, and David Plouffe. The interview was done by Dan Pfeiffer. Let me just get this out of there. I thought Pfeiffer did a great job. Like, anybody who's like, oh, you should have grilled him. No, come on. You're not going to get anything good out of grilling them right now. You just literally want to give them a microphone. To be totally honest, it would have been best if you literally just put a microphone in a room and then just flashed keywords on a screen and let them talk about it. That would be ideal. They did enough. They did plenty. This was a very nutritious interview if you knew what to look for, and I'm going to share that with you now. However, again, let me just encourage everybody to do this in the future. When you run a campaign, please put everything and anything that you can on tape as soon as possible. I love it. Oh, boy, do I love it. So let's start here. This is the first clip that I want to bring you. This is the top of the interview. We're going to go chronologically. How did you feel going into Election Day?
How did you feel going into Election Day? And at what point did you have a sense that things were beginning to break Trump's way? Was there a county result, something about the turnout? Like, was there a moment when you sort of understood that how it was going to end?
Well, the truth is that we really thought this was a very close race. We talked about the entire time we saw it as a margin of error race, almost the entire time the vice president was in the race. And we knew we had to have strong turnout on Election Day. We saw early vote really ending strong for us, and saw, the types of voters we wanted to see turn out. But we expected this to be close. We also expected that Florida was going to come in a bit redder. Virginia, we knew, was tracking to being, that we were going to be ahead, but that we would be ahead by less than we were in 2020. So we were expecting to see that when we saw that. We also did anticipate that the night would go relatively long because some of these states would take longer to come in. But I think it was, really after polls closed, there was nothing that we saw throughout the day. There was nothing that we saw that told us there was overwhelming turnout or anything out of complete expectations on Trump's side. But it really took us into the hours of, polls closing for us to know for sure that things were not tightening. They were tight, but they weren't tightening in the direction we needed them to be.
And is that just because Trump's turnout was so high?
Well, honestly, I think it's a little bit mixed. I mean, we saw certainly Trump turnout high in early vote. We really believe that to be mode shifting, and that's what I think it was. I think we also saw turnout was as expected in rural areas. Like, we didn't see anything that said, like maybe we saw in 16 or even in 20 that he had more turnout than we had anticipated. And our analytics really was quite close, much closer than it had been in 20 and in 16. But I do think we saw some lighter turnout in some of the areas we had hoped, but difference of a point here or there, which obviously in a close race makes a huge difference. And then I think we saw a little bit of a drop in support in a few areas for us. So that ultimately, I think, is why we weren't able to close the gap. It wasn't so much that what we were seeing in the battlegrounds was out of expectation or that he had some hidden turnout we hadn't picked up on.
So we're going to start here. This is Jen O'Malley, Dylan. This whole interview, especially at certain points, is so defensive that you just kind of strip through that to kind of get to the nectar in the center of it. The big key here, and this is a general theme throughout this entire interview, is everybody wants you to know that they're not an idiot. A lot of this is them having a conversation with people that are online. So it makes a lot more sense when you think about it in that perspective. But let's get into the kind of specific nutritious bits to it. They believed very much that the Donald Trump early vote surge, this is something that I told you a lot about on this show, was mode shifting. So that means that they believed that there was not a surge of new Trump voters. This was just election day Trump voters that were voting early, which means he would have a lower election day vote that would help them. So that partly explains the idea of why they were so enthusiastic going into election day. And they were talking about, oh, we're closing good, is because they believed Donald Trump's support was being cannibalized into early vote. That did not wind up being true, but it makes some kind of sense, I guess, if that is what you have gaslit yourself into believing. There's a lot of that coming up. She does have to say this, that no matter whether or not it's true, because, again, that was their campaign's narrative going into election day. But we get to the root of the issue, and I have this written down specifically. I do think that we saw some lighter turnout in some of the areas we had hoped, but it's a difference of a point here or there, which obviously in a close race makes a huge difference. I'll add editorially, dodoy. And then I think we saw a bit of a drop in support in a few areas for us. I think that's ultimately why we weren't able to close the gap. So, from their perspective, they did not do enough to turn out their base. They did not do enough to activate the voters they were counting on to get over the finish line. Here we go.
We did have some progress with undecideds at late October. So it was a dead heat race. But, at the end of the day, the political atmosphere was pretty brutal. And that's not an excuse. You had right track, wrong track, I think 28-72, about 70% of the country saying they were angry and dissatisfied. You had Trump's approval rating on his first term, frustratingly high, 48-51, depending on the state. Obviously, the incumbent president's approval rating around 38-41, depending on the state. I think the economy and inflation still driving a lot of votes. So I think given that we had a challenging political environment, the fact that we got the race to dead heat was positive, but boy, it was slow moving. And I think we were focused on 7 states. That's our windshield into the world, the battleground states. But what we saw on election day was, New Jersey and California and Connecticut and New York, massive shifts. So I think where Kamala Harris campaigned, we were able to keep the tide down a little bit, but it ended up being a pretty strong, tailwind for Donald Trump. And I think it's worth reminding everybody, we saw in 22, even though that was a pretty decent Democratic year, we saw these shifts. We saw them in 20, we saw them in 16. Trump specifically, but Republicans generally improving their vote share amongst non-college voters, particularly non-college voters of color. And this was a surprising race because Kamala Harris actually did, I think, better with senior voters than I think a lot of people would have thought. So margin of error race where we inherited a deficit, we got it to even, but the thing never moves.
There are 2 things that the Harris-Walz team would like you to come out of this conversation understanding. Number 1, there were historic headwinds headwinds, a challenging environment against Kamala Harris. And this is something that I was telling you guys from the beginning. I said from the beginning with Biden, I said from the beginning with Harris, at the end of the day, this is a 60-30 right track, wrong track country. It's going to be very hard and challenging for Kamala Harris or Joe Biden to win when people see the country going in that poor of a direction. Usually it's a throw the bums out situation. So you can create whatever the other narrative that you want around it, but you run yourself the risk of just creating a echo chamber that you yourself believe if you don't understand this one very clear clarion call coming from the populace. It sucks now. It's still a bit of excuse making because everybody knew this. And you should have known it. So if you're in a situation where you are in a 60-30 right track, wrong track, then you got to shake it up. You can't just min-max a normal campaign. Big things have to change. You need to demonstrate through actions that this is not acceptable. I understand where you're coming from, and I'm going to do something different. Because if you try to just be elegant about it, it just doesn't make any sense. All right, we got a little bit on the polling internally.
No, I mean, it was just basically a race that in the battlegrounds was 46-47, 47-48. So that's not where we started. We started behind. She was able to climb out. I think even after the debate, we might have gained, 0.51. It wasn't a race that moved a lot. And so I think when you think about our own internal analytics, if you have Wisconsin at 47-47, or Pennsylvania 48-47 Trump, let's say, which I think is where we had it at the end, you've got to have undecided break your way more than your opponents. And you've got to get a little benefit from turnout, which we weren't able to do.
Obviously,
so here we go. We get a sense of the Harris campaign's polling, specifically that their campaign analytics never showed the most bullish case that in some places were being shown by public polls, meaning Kamala Harris over 50% in some of the swing states. They never saw that. They were seeing things at 47, 47, 47, 48, 46, 47. That means that they understood Kamala Harris was going to be in a depressed position polling-wise, which is danger, Will Robinson, danger. I said on the show repeatedly that if Kamala Harris consistently polls at 47, then Donald Trump is the 47th president. She actually wound up doing better, but what they did not in any way see coming was Donald Trump doing better. In fact, totally missing from any of this conversation whatsoever, something that I'm going to get into with Ettingermentum a little bit later, and that is, do you need to think of Donald Trump as a popular candidate? They certainly did not. But the low public polling in their internal analytics does speak to some of the super schizophrenic idea of how they were messaging. If they were not seeing anything really take root in their favor, then it explains how they go from, boy, are they weird, Brat Summer, coconut memes, am I right? To, the man is Hitler, and he will round up you and your family if you don't vote Harris. Let's go to this. This is a Quentin Fulks who you are about to hear.
were you able to do any thinking or planning in that 1 month period about what a race with the vice president would look like, or did you have to sort of start cold on that first day, the moment you got the call or the statement went out?
I mean, we started cold. There was no planning involved in any other candidates. I mean, we were honestly in crisis management mode of keeping President Biden in the race, convincing, Democratic allies that he could still do this. And one of the things was trying to keep the president out on the road as much. We were still doing everything we could from a campaign, and he made the decision that he did not want to continue on. And he pulled some of the senior leadership together and said that he was going to be with the vice president. It also wasn't anything that our team took for granted to just say, okay, she is the nominee. We knew that there was still a situation where we had to shore up delegates, and that's where we started from. And then after that point, that is when we begin to say, okay, how can we define her?
So Quentin Fulks is somebody that I thought was probably, came off the best in this interview. He was the most kind of no BS, at least of those four. He ran Raphael Warnock's campaign in Georgia. In my estimation, he's probably somebody that will be highly sought after this. I don't know if I could say the same about the other three, Jenna Malley-Dillon, Stephanie Cutter, or David Plouffe. One has to wonder that if you were going back in time and you were switching from Biden to Harris, whether or not it might have also made sense to put Quentin Fulks at the top of the leadership. I think he will probably get his chance to do that going forward. But I just wanted to play that clip so you guys know. Quentin Fulks, a name that I think that you're probably going to hear more of. The rest of these names, not so much. Hey, how many days did the Harris-Walz campaign have?
So in 107 days, what typically takes us a year and a half, 2 years in a presidential campaign, we were defining someone who was wholly undefined from the start.
Huh. That's a specific number of days.
So this is where there was a price to be paid for the short campaign. And you can't even say 107 days, because to Quentin's point, some of that was spent shoring up the Democratic nomination.
Well, I'll be. It was even less than that specific number of days.
We spent much more time trying to raise the stakes of a second term than re-arbitrating the first, because voters just weren't open to that. So that's why pointing out his tariff and what that would mean in terms of a huge sales tax for the American people, the fact that he's more unhinged, he wants unchecked power. Project 2025 ended up being about as popular as the Ebola virus. So we did a lot of good work there. And now, of course, the son of a bitch lied about it, and he's hiring everybody who authored it. Project 2025 is going to be the Trump administration agenda, as we pointed out.
So not to make this I was really right about this race. I was right. I was right about a lot of stuff. And this is one of the things that always confused me. And that's like, we irradiated. We made Project 2025 less popular than the Ebola virus. And you're right. You did. It went from something that was not on the radar at all to something that was extremely negative, and the Trump campaign eventually had to distance themselves from. The problem is that the Trump campaign really didn't care about Project 2025. Project 2025 did not mean anything to Republican voters, so Trump distancing himself from it didn't really cost him anything. And essentially, you spent a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort defining something that Trump could get credit for walking away from. You made a trash barge a toxic waste dump, and then allowed the person that you're trying to beat to push it away off into the sea. I never got Project 2025 as a strategy because of that. You don't need to invent a scary brand. Donald Trump is the scary brand. Make that brand scary. To invent something else or to highlight something else, again, I think there are probably voters, considering how bipartisan his support was, that gave him credit for walking away from it. You made it up. You made a villain. He was able to get credit for walking away from it, and all you were left to do was say, boo-hoo-hoo, he's lying. Great. Trade those credits in at the Sizzler and see if you get to the baked potato bar. Hey, how many days did they have in this race?
I think that in a 107-day race, it is very difficult to do all the things you would normally do in a year and a half, 2 years.
Damn, 107 days. That's wild. There's a fair amount of self-delusion on this podcast, and I want to highlight one of the pinnacles of it. Here's a clip. I believe this is Jenna Malley-Dillon.
Anywhere we campaign in all 7 of these states, where Donald Trump, by the way, campaigned too, he did worse and we did better. And we did make real progress against these national headwinds. If in every other state but the battlegrounds, there was a negative 8-point shift to the right, in the battlegrounds, there was only 3. So we needed it to be better than that. And perhaps if we had more time, we could have done that.
So again, everybody in this is trying to get hired again. Everybody in this is trying to prove to everybody that was around them and all the donors that gave them money that they are competent. And so you do a lot of explaining why what you did was good. And it's like, oh, well, yeah, we got blown out in all the other states. But the states that we actually cared about, that we actually worked on, that we actually put money into, then we only lost those by 3% compared to 2020. Well, cool. All those states were decided by less than 3% in the previous election. So you lost. You lost all 7 swing states. This is not something to brag about. You know, I know that they're not going to do this because, again, it's career suicide. Although maybe, I don't know, radical honesty sometimes has its place. But there's not a lot of lessons that you should take out of this campaign. You really shouldn't. When you have that much money and you have a chance at a fresh start, if you're assuming that Kamala Harris is a fresh start compared to Joe Biden, you know, what else do you want? Like, granted, it's not the ideal situation, but nobody running for president is in an ideal situation unless you're a popular incumbent. And you weren't a popular incumbent, so congratulations. You had about as good a shot as anybody. You had a better shot than most financially. This clip blows my mind. This is Stephanie Cutter. And I think it is emblematic of the ability for the modern Democratic Party to gaslight themselves into pure fictions. Here we go. Stephanie Cutter.
So we did talk about things like she's a different generation. Most of her career is from outside of Washington, not inside Washington. So she knows a lot of the best ideas are from across the country. Her career has been about reaching across the aisle, finding common sense ways to get things done. It's not been based in ideological politics. All of these things, we were trying to tell a story and give the impression that she was different without pointing to a specific issue.
I'm going to break down what you just heard. All right. So we did talk about things like she's of a different generation. She's 50 years old. All right. So she's of a different, yeah, granted, 28 years younger than Donald Trump, who's the oldest candidate, and more than that to Joe Biden. But she's 50, right? So she's not the Barack Obama very beginning of his political campaign. Not bad, right? New generation, okay. Most of her career is from outside of Washington, not inside Washington. It's all from California, okay? She grew up in California, was a California politician, came to California, or came to D.C. as a representative from California, and then went to the White House. But if you talk about her being, most of her career was from outside Washington, it's from California. Okay? The most identifiably proud progressive state in the union. She didn't come from Iowa. She didn't come from Michigan. She didn't come from Texas, Florida, Georgia, Wisconsin, New York, anywhere. She came from California. And if you don't recognize that that branding cannot just be painted over by saying, well, she was from outside Washington. She's from California. It carries with it a reputation, especially now. If you want to understand modern politics, man, all right, this is another quote here. She knows a lot of her best ideas are from across the country. Yes, across the plains in California, the most proudly progressive state in the union. Her career has been about reaching across the aisle, finding common sense ways to get things done. This is a lie. This is just like, I mean, you can just say things that aren't true and you can hope people believe them. But Kamala Harris came from a one-party state and then had no meaningful reaching across the aisle moments when she was a senator before she became a member of the White House. Whether or not it was progressive or centrism, there was never a question that Kamala Harris was a ready, willing, and able Democratic vote. She wasn't Kyrsten Sinema. She wasn't Joe Manchin. She wasn't John Fetterman, right? Who at least has the patina of the idea that he could cross the aisle. She wasn't John Tester. She was a California senator. Cutter goes on. It's not been based in ideological politics. It has. Like, all these things, we were trying to tell a story and give the impression that she was different without pointing to a specific issue. There's this concept, we're going to get into it with Ettingermentum, that the Democratic Party believes everything is messaging. Everything can be rewritten if you say the right words. More than any personal idea, more than any concept, any where you land on the ideological spectrum, Democrats, for the love of God, it's not that. You do shape the story how you want it. The audience not dumb. Okay? They're not slow. They remember things more than 5 seconds ago. So if you're going to tell a story, you have to tell a story about Kamala Harris that involves proud progressive politics in California. You just do. Here we go. They finally got into the trans ad.
On the trans attack, one, obviously it was a very effective ad at the end. I ultimately don't believe that it was about the issue of trans. I think that it made her seem out of touch. And it was sort of a pseudo-economic ad underneath it because he was saying you're going to pay for it with taxpayer money. And it was in her own words. And that's something. But we tested a ton of responses to this, direct responses. And none of them ever tested as well as basically her, talking about what she would do, to Jen's point, the future, the type of president that she would be. There were elements of it where we did try to say, and we put ads on television of her saying, you've seen all the negative attacks against me, and try to bottle it up, because I also think you have to think about the entire sentiment when you're running a paid campaign. And the trans ad, I think because of the content, a lot of people felt like it was much bigger than what it was. But to put that into context, Team Red, meaning Trump and all the super PACs that were spending on Trump's behalf, that was 7% of their total ads was on that issue.
Was that specific? I think it was
specific.
2 ads, right?
Yeah.
There was the original, and then there was the one with Charlemagne. Yep.
And it was all Trump. So Trump spent, 37% of his, $200 million on that ad, but Trump wasn't the only spender. We were getting hit across the board. And so you have to take into account what all the super PACs are doing and play off of that. And I think that's what Trump was doing. His super PACs were hitting us on the economy, immigration, and crime. And Trump even started hitting us on immigration. And I think the veracity of which we came out of the gate and responded to that, they weren't expecting that from us. And then they backed off of that. And at that point, they started going into it. And so it is easy to say with the kind of resources that we raised, we should have been able to do everything. But that's not the case. You have to make decisions in the time frame that we were in this race. We had to choose. And we chose to focus more of our attention on, one, driving down Trump, because that was not being done in our ecosystem on our side. And it was incredibly important that we did that, as well as defining her. And so if we spent this entire race, and not to be defensive about it at all, but if we spent this entire race pushing back on immigration attacks or crime attacks and pushing back against trans attacks, at what point are we bringing Trump down and or introducing the vice president on our own terms? We're playing on their field. And I think that was ultimately what went into it. But again, it wasn't something that we missed. It's just all of our testing told us that the approach that we were taking of her being more positive and talking about the economy and what she would do was a better tactic.
Not to be sort of overly nerdy about it, but that 7% is total money spent, not number of ads run.
Yes.
So it's higher than that in terms of ads run, because it was candidate side ads, right?
Yeah. But I mean,
probably like Do you know?
But we did. I mean, I would just add, we did respond. What our testing showed, and look, there's no easy answers to this.
Yeah, of course.
But we looked at this a lot, and we, and she never got directly asked about it, but was, obviously something we looked at in responding there. But we did respond for the people that were getting this on digital, and we did a ton more digital than the other side did. But we definitely threw out ads to make sure anyone that was getting these directly, we would be engaging with them with a little bit more specific content. Obviously, she spoke to some of this in the Fox News interview and the Trump administration oversight during this period. But we saw that we could neutralize the ad, but we couldn't actually put points on the board for us if we responded in kind. So then you really have a question. People don't know her. They need to know more about who she is, what she stands for. They're concerned about the economy. They're concerned about immigration, and we need to push down Trump's numbers. So how do you fit all of that in? And what we tested showed us that ads that were much more, as Quentin is saying, on the economy or other issues that people cared more about actually had better response for our testing than head-to-head. So, as we looked at this, the Trump side didn't close on this issue. Obviously, economy was far more effective, and we had to really play the game there, and we had a lot of work to do, and we were successful to a point. But that's sort of the balance that we had. And while we had a lot of resources in a short amount of time, we were also trying to think about what does a person receive. We looked at certainly testing, but we're looking at our qualitative, and a lot of people thought it was very political. They thought it was over the top. They had different kind of points of view that didn't really anchor it as a vote mover. But I know it anecdotally had a lot of attention, and they played it in places that we saw it and we monitored it as we went.
And I would just add, Dan, so both campaigns, super PACs, there was a lot of national ads. So I think if you're sitting in California or Texas or Florida, you see this ad, you don't see any of our responses, right? So in the battleground states, her talking, in a very common sense way, in a very practical way, whether it be about immigration, whether it be about the economy, was our best defense because this was less about trends than it was about priorities and being out of the mainstream. So I think these voters in the battleground states, both through ads and through seeing her doing local interviews, and I think that's one of the reasons you had such a difference between the battleground states and the non-battleground states, is people knew her better, number one. Number two, as Jen said, it's very easy these days to understand who has experience in ads. So we were feeding a lot of digital ads to people who might have saw that spot. But, at the end of the day, we were spending a lot of time with voters in these battleground states, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And this trans ad was not driving vote. I mean, the most effective ad, Quentin, I think they ran was not that. It was the Bidenomics ad, right? Because that was kind of core to people's concern. It was like, well, maybe you're not change. You're defending an economic program that I don't think's helped me. Listen, I think we'll are very proud of what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Democrats did to help us dig out of the pandemic, but people weren't feeling it. So that was more effective. So I think in many respects, my concern here, as we think about the future, is if there's a belief that if only we had responded to this trans ad with national and huge battleground state ads, we would have won. I don't think that's true, number one. Number two, I think there's also a fact pattern here. So if we could have just said that's a lie, it's not anything she's ever believed. She was on tape. Surgery for for people who want to transition in prison was part of the Biden-Harris platform in 2020. It was part of what the administration did, right? We also saw Colin Allred and Sherrod Brown, both who ran good races, kind of directly responded to trans attacks. And in our view, you're playing on your opponent's side of the field. I understand why they felt they needed to do that in those states. So to Quentin's point, you have a set of things you're trying to get done. It doesn't mean that you're in such a tunnel that when something comes at you that you don't, Jen, Quentin, Stephanie, I don't know, dozens of hours on this. Like, what should we do? How are voters responding to it? Maybe hundreds of hours on it. So we took it very seriously, but it wasn't something, at the end of the day, what matters in election is something causing someone to behave differently, either who they vote for or whether they vote. And our sense was in the battleground states, this was not driving vote behavior to the same extent like the economy was generally, even immigration. So I think that it's important to understand, I think, that we were very much in voyeuristic listening mode here in terms of how are voters processing this. And in the battleground states, what we got from voters, that doesn't seem like her. Like she seems sort of mainstream and normal, number one. It's a political attack, and we trust it. So I think in many respects, Democrats who live outside of battleground states would see this ad and were convinced it was the thing that cost us the election. But I think in the battleground states, it was a different brew.
Well, I also, the last point I'll make on this too is that I think, again, to Pluff's point about it moving vote, I think that the Trump campaign knew that too. And I think that the way in which they targeted this ad, they were trying to, I think, make our job harder with black voters. I'm just going to say it point blank. And I think that specifically with black men, ultimately we got the same amount of the vote share that President Biden got with black men, and we increased among black women. But when you look at where Trump was running this ad, it was in Philadelphia, it was in Atlanta, and then the outer markets where there wasn't as many diverse voters or black voters, they weren't doing this. We saw them targeting this in the mailboxes of black voters, black male voters. So there was this theory out there that we were struggling with black men. And I think that while we were doing the work to try to make sure that that wasn't the case, and we saw that consolidation come back after President Biden got out of the race, I think that Trump and them weren't using this ad to move vote share as much. I think that they were using this ad to try to make our job of getting these voters back or consolidating them. And I think ultimately, if you look at it from that metric, it wasn't effective.
All right. So there's a lot of good stuff here. First, they do understand why it was effective. That's good. Second, very much on brand for this campaign, they talk about over-intellectualizing why they shouldn't do anything. If you listen to a lot of the like most difficult questions that are leveled by the host here, they tend to always get into this idea of, well, we thought about that, and then we thought about another thing, and then we thought about another thing, and then we thought about another thing, and at the end of the day, we just decided maybe we don't do anything. And this is the way that, like, every smart person in my life has made the dumbest decisions they've ever made. Sometimes you can be too smart. Sometimes your fear of things going wrong can result in you actually doing something incredibly stupid. In my opinion, it wasn't that they didn't respond to the anti-trans ad. My problem with it is that obviously if this is resonating, then you need to continue this conversation. You need to say, yeah, I had that conversation. It's something that's been a evolving thing for me. Here's where I am now. I've learned a lot since that campaign. In fact, acknowledging, doing an interview about like, hey, that 2019 campaign, how did that, you really got your ass kicked. And talk about what her lessons were. I was this, I was that. I feel like I got pushed off my own values. I'm not blaming anybody. I got to blame myself, but that's what I'm bringing into this. I said a lot of stuff that, I thought people wanted me to hear. I don't know why I said it. Here's where I stand on trans rights, blah, blah, blah. Humanity. Let people connect to you. They didn't do any of it. But here's the other thing. They make a point to say at the end of that clip that they ultimately don't believe that the trans ad hurt them all that much because they believe that ad was there to depress black women and black men from voting for Harris. And they say, by the numbers, we did as good as we could with those. That's not why we lost the election. So a lot of talk, a little action. Flip on over to the Axe Files with Chris LaCivita, where they also talk about this ad. Chris LaCivita says the reason why we ran that ad within an inch of its life, why we kept putting money into it. And he said, look, I didn't like it. I didn't like the idea that we'd be putting that much money into it because it's about the economy. Why are we spending any money that's not about the economy? but they kept seeing how well it tested with two groups: Hispanic voters and white suburban moms. That was an issue that the Trump campaign knew that they had to do better with, especially in light of abortion. And the Harris campaign had to maximize. Thought it was very interesting that the winning side said that ad affected those two, and the losing side were patting themselves on the back, saying, actually, it didn't really. We were able to handle the two groups that they really tried to attack. Let's hear some whining about super PACs, shall we?
And he had an army of super PACs that were so coordinated. I'm sure there's some legal way they were coordinated, but
I'm sure it was legal.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
Or illegal.
Yes.
But they, from the beginning, they were, week to week, all, one super PAC would take a couple weeks and hit Pennsylvania, and then the next one would come in and do the same, and they were all coordinated. We didn't have the benefit of that. So I am very confident that the fidelity of our finances was strong throughout, and we focused it on direct voter contact.
Future Forward is going to get shredded in this election. Future Forward, if you're not aware, was the official super PAC of this presidential election, and I don't think they did a good job. The campaign doesn't think they did a good job. You had newspaper articles that were coming out talking about how bad of a job they were doing while the campaign was going on, and obviously they're very frustrated here. The way that it manifests itself in this interview is for them to say we should have multiple super PACs and they should be able to do whatever they want. Essentially what they're saying is, I hate Future Forward. Future Forward sucked. Future Forward cost this election. When the books come out, the knives will be deep in the back of the Future Forward PAC. Still, loser nonsense. Why are you even talking? Come on. You guys raise hundreds of millions of dollars more than your opposition. You're going to complain about, well, the money didn't go to the right people. Get out of here. Let's get to the Joe Rogan of it all.
I hate to repeat this over and over, but it was a very short race with a limited number of days. And for a candidate to leave the battleground to go to Houston, which is a day off the playing field in the battleground, getting that timing right is really important. So we had discussions with Joe Rogan's team. They were great. They wanted us to come on. We wanted to come on. We tried to get a date to make it work, and ultimately we just weren't able to find a date. We did go to Houston, and she gave a great speech at an amazing event.
The Beyonce event?
Yes. Well, I'm going to call it reproductive freedom. And because Texas is ground zero for the impact of these Trump abortion bans. There's a story out today, in fact, of another young woman who lost her life because of it. And we were hoping to be able to fit it in around that. And ultimately weren't able to do it. As it turns out, that was the day that Trump was taping his Joe Rogan. Which they had never confirmed to us. We kind of figured that out in the lead up to it. She was ready, willing to go on Joe Rogan. Would it have changed anything? It would have been it would have broken through, not because of the conversation with Joe Rogan, but because the fact that she was doing it. And that was really the benefit of it. Will she do it sometime in the future? Maybe. Who knows? But it, didn't ultimately impact the outcome one way or the other. But she was willing to do whatever it takes.
So that's Stephanie Cutter. I just want you to soak in the self-pity that passes for accountability with this crew. Because she starts out by saying, we were talking to Joe Rogan, and we wanted to come on. They wanted us to come on. But we were in Texas. The one day that we were going to be in Texas, it turns out that they had already booked Donald Trump, which apparently they didn't tell us. So, by the end of that, just that sentence, she doesn't get out of that sentence without blaming the Rogan people. Did they really want us on? Did they really want us on? By the way, the Caller Daddy host was, I believe, at the New York Times Deal Book conference today. And, we know by way of the FEC expenditure reports that it was $100,000 for them to build a fake set. What was said to be in a hotel. Turns out it wasn't a hotel, according to the Caller Daddy lady, Alex Cooper. It was in a house. She says a random house. And then when said that it was $100,000, she's like, oh no. It's like cardboard walls. That was not $100,000. You do not need $100,000 to do that. But apparently when you're going on Harris Walls prices, that's what it costs. Again, over-intellectualizing. That's what I got out of this. And this is endemic to the Democratic Party. The people that have had the most success in the Democratic Party recently are people that just go with their gut. They do things that aren't necessarily poll tested because at least it shows that you're a human being. The people that, obey this groupthink, what are you going to do? All right. Well, here's them explaining also why they didn't do interviews.
Does it help in where we stand now? If you're a candidate with a limited amount of time to get your voice out there and define yourself, you kind of have to do everything. But did it screw with our narrative? Not just in getting shit for not doing enough earned media, but getting questions that we knew voters weren't going to care about. And their myopic mindset on certain issues was not what the race was going to be about. So at a certain point, we had to decide, is this helping us or hurting us? And
what did you decide? You can say it.
I would say, I mean, look, I am not media hater by any measure. And I think that, we women don't get far in life talking about double standards. So that's not the point. But I do think a narrative, 107 days, 2 weeks up because of a hurricane, 2 weeks talking about how she didn't do interviews, which, she was doing plenty, but we were doing in our own way. We had to, be the nominee, had to find a running mate and do a rollout. I mean, there was all these things that you kind of want to factor in, but real people heard in some way that we were not going to have interviews, which was both not true and also so counter to any kind of standard that was put on Trump that I think that was a problem. And then on top of that, we would do an interview, and to Stephanie's point, the questions were small and processy and about
dumb.
They were not informing a voter who was trying to listen to learn more or to understand. And I'm not here to say that the whole system was focused on us incorrectly. I'm just saying, again, of the things we need to explore as we move forward as a campaign and as a country, that does a disservice to voters. And
longstanding bon mot of mine is that when you are looking at politics like political, or like Dungeons and Dragons, races and classes, right? You have to understand that a Democrat just has +5 media. Anything you do, you're going to get a more favorable role. You're going to have people looking out for you. You're going to have an easier way to take another bite at the apple and reframe the narrative however you want. That's just what a Democrat gets. Republicans get -5 media. You can complain about it. You can say it's not fair. I've talked people's ears off about why I believe that is the case from the journalist side, which is where I come from. But them's the breaks in the big city, okay? So either you fight on the terrain you understand or you complain about it. There is nothing that should be disqualifying for a Democratic campaign organizer more than complaining about the media. So just so we know, they were distracted by the noise that they weren't doing interviews, which is unfair because they did do interviews, more interviews than Trump, by the way. But they also didn't do interviews because the interviews that they did do were bad. Make sense? Do you know they had 107 days to run this campaign? Let's talk about Liz Cheney.
Well, first of all, like any organization, that's got the resources in the private sector, or in this case in politics, you make as many decisions as you can based on data by the marketplace. Okay. So, turnout was up in Milwaukee. It was down a little bit in Philadelphia and Detroit. But, we'd spent a lot of time with voters who we were concerned weren't going to vote. And the fact that Liz Cheney was supporting Kamala Harris was not an issue raised by any of them. Okay. So I'd say a couple of things. We were in a challenging political environment where to get to 50% of the vote in enough states to win 270 electoral votes, we needed some percentage of Republicans. But I think what people forget is it's more the independents who act like Republicans, where issues of democracy, of how unhinged he is, Project 2025 mattered to them, even to some conservative Democrats. Also, when you're being attacked as being a crazy, out of touch California liberal, when you have generals and former Republican elected officials saying, I'm for Kamala Harris, that helps rebut that. In many respects, that'll be more effective than what she would say herself. And then as it relates to the comments about, wanting generals like Hitler, that bothered voters. Okay. This is something that concerned them about, okay, he seems like he's lost a step. He seems a little more unhinged, unstable. The people who worked for him last time are warning us. And now he says something like this. So yeah, we could have decided to ignore that and just say, let's talk about tax cuts today. I don't think that would have advanced the ball with the people we needed to advance it with. And again, I just want to, it can sound like making excuses. This political environment sucked, okay? We were dealing with ferocious headwinds. And I think people's instinct was to give the Republicans and even Donald Trump another chance. So we had a complicated puzzle to put together here in terms of the voters. And it was going to take a little bit more independent Republicans than we saw in 20, maybe 1% more Republican voters for us. It was going to take voters saying, even though I judged Trump's first term favorably, I'm more concerned about him this time. We had to get more voters to say that. So, and if you look at how we closed, I think we did one day with Liz Cheney in the last couple of weeks. You look at the ads we ran, they were heavily centered on the economy, on tax cuts, on Trump being for the wealthy. So this notion that somehow we weren't focused on the economy, that was the driving motivation and message in our campaign. The closing speech, yes, it took place at the Ellipse, was a huge contrast on the economy and the people Donald Trump would fight for and the people Kamala Harris would fight for. So I think that mistakes, I think my concern about that is just, again, we have to understand that what happened in this election and what didn't. And, I think at the end of the day, we had to raise people's concern and the threat level of a Trump second term. I think if you look at our internal data, and Quentin can speak to this, we did a lot of that. We just didn't get it to the extent that we needed to win.
That's David Plouffe. Look, having listened to this a couple times, at least the Liz Cheney thing, I now kind of understand in a weird 2 + 2 = 4 way. If you're already upside down about who you think your candidate is, if you're already upside down about how you're understanding the landscape, you're wrong about both of them. You've gaslit yourself into believing that Kamala Harris is Bill Clinton in 94. Then at least I understand we need Republican. Let's put Republican that endorsed us on stage. It fundamentally misunderstands who I believe Republican, or at least Republican leaners, are. I think you pretty much had the ones that you wanted. There's things that you can give them that don't have you tying yourself to the Cheney family. Even if you're gonna tie yourself to the Cheney family, there's ways to do it that don't include you going out and talking about the great legacy of Dick Cheney. But again, this is the group that saw Kamala Harris as a non-ideological aisle crosser who understands that great ideas come from outside Washington, but won't mention California. Hey, how many days do they have?
So I think there is a lot more work to do to kind of understand this more and think about it. But I don't think it is the work of just a 107-day campaign or even a presidential campaign.
Damn, that's like a little over 3 months, right? But how many days?
We had a Democratic candidate get in 107 days out, part of an administration, coming out of COVID, inflation, et cetera.
107 days. 107 days. For the record, I counted it up in the transcript, and I don't know because sometimes the transcript went 107 and 107 spelled out. 10 times. They mentioned it 10 times in a 60-minute interview. That's a lot of times. This is your update brought to you by TakePoliticsSeriously.com. That's where you need to go if you want to support this show. Thank you to everybody who has done it. There's a little static about the gift subscriptions. I've gotten emails. I said that I would do a video for anybody that you buy a gift subscription for from now until the end of Hanukkah. So that's like after New Year's Eve. For whatever reason, we're getting a little static. They're saying that there might be a technical problem on Substack's side. I'm talking to Substack. We'll clear it up. Offer still stands. Nothing is sold out. I do know that it was able to work for me when I bought myself a $12 a month subscription to the bonus stuff. That's the monthly subscription. So you can do that, but I would suggest you buy somebody the $99 one because that's a more robust gift. We'll be updating you on that. I will do a video. I will do a video for anybody that you get a gift, that you get this as a gift to, and I look forward to doing a bunch of them. TakePoliticsSeriously.com. Let's do our update because this is already a long-ass episode. Elon Musk, tapped by President-elect Donald Trump to co-lead the Department of Government Efficiency with Vivek Ramaswamy, proposed eliminating tax credits for electric vehicles and all subsidies while he was on Capitol Hill on Thursday. During meetings with lawmakers, including Senate Majority Leader John Thune and Senator Joni Ernst, Musk discussed reducing federal spending and boosting productivity. He is a staunch advocate for cutting subsidies. Musk argued that they harm market efficiency, claiming that Tesla would benefit if people did not have $7,000 to buy one of his cars with. His stance contrasts with the Biden administration's reliance on subsidies to support clean energy initiatives under the Inflation Reduction Act, which faces potential rollback by congressional Republicans using budget reconciliation. I think that is almost assuredly going to happen. And you would make the argument that Elon is the only one building a car that can survive charging $7,000 more for, or being at the same, just understanding that people are going to have to pay $7,000 more for a Tesla. It's got the brand value, it's got the reputation, and he is building it at a price that he can still make money at it. There's a question mark on a lot of other electric cars because it's hard for people to make them if you're not making them at a gigantic scale. There's a reason why Tesla was in the red for a while, because you got to build the efficiency to really, move them at a pace and build them at a price that you can make cash on. It appears, and I would not be shocked if some of this comes to a head within the next few days, if not hours, that Pete Hegseth's nomination for Secretary of Defense is faltering. The Hill reporting that 7 to 8 senators are currently not sold on Hegseth. Joni Ernst is probably the biggest key here. She has not been sold thus far. Pete Hegseth has been on the Hill. He was in New York City doing a charm offensive, talking to Megyn Kelly, bringing his mom on Fox and Friends. He did a big mini Kavanaugh moment on Capitol Hill to reporters saying that I don't answer to the media, I answer to Donald Trump, and I answer to the American people. Good for him. The problem is that we've now seen two names that are more palatable to these senators, Ron DeSantis and possibly Joni Ernst herself, that would be far easier to pass through the Senate. Hegseth is being tarred on personal stuff and the fact that he was already going to be somebody that did not come from a big organizational perspective. Joni Ernst is somebody that obviously from the Senate, they're going to value her experience because the judgment here is of senators. And Ron DeSantis has run a massive state and was a former Navy lawyer. So that's ultimately what I think is going to decapitate Hegseth, and the fact that if it were just Hegseth being a philanderer, maybe you get some pity from Trump. The alcoholism stuff, and that's, nobody said he's an alcoholic, but that's the implication of he got too drunk at weddings, he showed up drunk to work, blah, blah, blah. That's kind of a death sentence for Trump. Trump does not like addiction at all. He views it as a personal character trait. He loved his older brother. His older brother died of addiction. And so, you know, that's another thing. What the Hill pointed out was like, the senator's like, well, hey, where do you think this DeSantis stuff is coming from? It's coming from Mar-a-Lago. So we're not going to get in trouble with Trump if we spike Hegseth. And if you have that going, kind of looks like Pete might be on the way out. Finally, billionaire Frank McCourt's Project Liberty is assembling a consortium to pursue a people's bid of TikTok as a U.S. court decides its fate by January 19th, with informal commitments exceeding $20 billion. The bid seeks to acquire TikTok's U.S. operation valued at $20 to $100 billion. Project Liberty aims to build a safer internet, prioritizing privacy and democracy, and is supported by internet pioneers like Tim Berners-Lee. In collaboration with Guggenheim Securities and Kirkland and Ellis, McCourt plans to leverage blockchain-based protocols for secure social networking. Of course, the bid faces resistance from China as they don't want to allow TikTok to be sold. I would make the argument that in a post-AI reality world, buying TikTok without the algorithm is a lot more feasible than it was before. The value of TikTok's algorithm was that nobody in America would think to have enough human labor to categorize every user-submitted video on enough categories that an algorithm could quickly and near magically feed people exactly what they wanted. And that is a Chinese way of thinking. A Chinese way of thinking is like, wait, hold on. We only need like 100,000 people that get paid nearly nothing to be in an unventilated basement and watch garbage fly in so they can hit 9 different boxes. Let's go. Like, that's in America, you get to that part of the problem and you think, we got to out engineer it. China, they're like, throw bodies at it. Let's go. Let's do it. With AI, and especially where AI is now, and it certainly wasn't the last time we went through this with TikTok, I think you can build that algorithm. You have out-engineered the problem now. You can create a competitive algorithm to TikToks in a way that if you bought it without the algorithm, you could plug in your own, and I think it could be good enough. You might even be able to do it off the rack more than you ever have in the past. That being said, who knows? Who knows how this is going to go? That's your update. TakePoliticsSeriously.com is where you go. 2 bonus episodes each and every week for the price of a cup of coffee. You can get exactly that if you pay monthly. But if you buy it for the year, you get over 150 episodes in total for less than $100. That isn't buying me a cup of coffee. That's making me a cup of coffee. That's like 60 cents an episode. Jeez Louise. Now, let's get to Alice Ollstein. We would like to welcome to the program Alice Miranda Ollstein. She writes for Politico and has done some reporting on where the pro-choice movement, and specifically some of the advocacy groups that have pushed for this, go from here. This was supposed to be the Rose revenge election, and obviously there are a lot of questions to be asked. Welcome to the show, Alice.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
So what did you find?
Yeah, so again, this piece I wrote and the conversations I had were right in the immediate aftermath of the election. And so I think a lot of people were sort of still in shock, still processing. And I found just a lot of widespread confusion and people being really at a loss to explain why this happened, given that polling shows that most people agree more with Democrats than Republicans when it comes to the abortion issue, trust them more to handle it. And you saw these pro-abortion rights initiatives pass in almost every state where they were on the ballot. Not every state, and we can get into that later. But just a real struggle to understand how people could, on the very same ballot, the very same voters, check the box both for these initiatives and for politicians like Donald Trump, like some Senate candidates who believe the exact opposite. That contradiction is something that these groups are still struggling with. And, as they stare down, this Republican trifecta in Washington, as well as Republican gains at the state level in a lot of places, there is a real disagreement and confusion about how to best move forward right now. Of course, there are a lot of plans that various groups have, both on the legal front, although there's now less hope on that front given the makeup of the courts and how they've shifted to the right over the past few years. There are legislative plans, there are advocacy plans, but you're not seeing sort of a cohesive push right now, and an agreement. You're not seeing an agreement about what went wrong and how to fix it in the future.
It's so funny that you put it like that, because it mirrors almost exactly articles that I read after the Ohio abortion referendum, where it was almost the exact same thing on the pro-life side, where almost down to the words that we need to get on the same message. We're not, the same thing isn't working. And part of, if you're seeing it on both sides, what it says to me is that post-Dobbs, we just fundamentally have a different, more segmented, and I would say more nuanced conversation politically about a lot of these issues. The problem for both the pro-life and the pro-choice movements that existed beforehand is that everything was a catch-all. Everything was pro-choice or pro-life, and you could have varying different ways that you got there on either side. But do you have a sense in from the sources that you talk to that they realize this is just going to be a different conversation post-Dobbs, and this was probably the last time that people were going to raise money like this for such a simple sort of bumper sticker cause?
So yeah, I think one, we're just sort of coming to the end of this really unprecedented run of state ballot initiatives, because we're just running out of states where that's even possible to do. A lot of states don't allow those kinds of ballot initiatives to be put forward by groups or citizens. And so there's only a handful of those left where this fight could play out in the future. So this has proven one of the most powerful post-Dobbs tools for restoring or expanding or defending abortion rights, but we're sort of running out of road on that strategy, and there's a real need that these groups feel to develop different strategies, and both in terms of how to communicate with the electorate. There's a lot of concern about misinformation or just an inability to reach people, given how siloed and polarized people are in where they get their information from, what sources they trust. And so, there was a real frustration that I heard on the part of folks on the left saying, like, look, we gave voters all this information. We showed them these stories of women who have suffered and even died as a result of these bans, and it didn't seem to matter. And there's disagreements about what they should have and could have done differently, and a lot of wrestling that still needs to happen in order to come up with some new battle plans in the future.
Well, let's go through some of those real quick. What are you hearing as the Monday morning quarterback, so to speak, of what could have been done, what could have been said, what could have been highlighted from some of the factions here?
Sure. So there are some who feel that both the Democratic Party and some of these groups sort of catered too much to the right or to the center on their messaging, on their outreach. That shows up in the abortion space, but I think it also shows up more broadly. There's a lot of criticism of, going on the campaign trail with the Cheneys, for instance, and asking,
Sure.
who was that really for? Who are the voters who are won over by that? But
many such cases of asking that particular question, including on this show repeatedly.
Yes, I've heard that a lot. I mean, in the abortion space, I think it manifests as asking, why was the message restore Roe and not push even further, given that Roe, a lot of abortion restrictions were in place in a lot of parts of the country when Roe was still in place. And so there are groups sort of on the further left who saw that as inherently sort of conservative capitulating messaging instead of something more bold and exciting that could have energized people. They also thought that there was too much of a focus on appealing to a specific kind of voter, namely moderate, white, suburban women, at the expense of maybe other groups who are more reliable Democratic voters. People of color, the traditional base. And so I think, yes, you're hearing this sort of reckoning both on the message and the target audience of the message.
Yeah, it's the question for me, and this even goes back to Biden after the Dobbs decision dropped, was that it just seemed like it was the same. It was even saying we're going to restore Roe. It just sounds like Roe is on the ballot, which is what the Democratic messaging has been for every election in my lifetime. And I don't know if they noticed, but Roe's no longer there. So if it was so important, if it was the only thing that mattered, if it was the reason to go out and cast your ballot and check D all the way down, then it just doesn't show urgency. And that was, I think, the biggest thing when I was looking at this race is that if Kamala Harris had gone to Nevada, gone to Arizona, gone to Florida, some of these places that had the abortion ballot initiatives, and at least said, hey, look, when I'm president, I'm going to do everything I can when I get 60 votes. But for right now, we need to win these cases. And I'm going to go to places like Florida that aren't necessarily on the swing state map, but it matters that much to me. At least it would have shown urgency. I think it was emblematic of a lot of Democratic issues where everything was sort of kind of paint by numbers, but it didn't feel passionate in the same kind of way that I think the voters really wanted it to. But I guess that's probably some of the same stuff that you're hearing.
Yeah, so a couple things. One, I think there was an inherent tension between the goals of the ballot initiative campaigns and the presidential campaign. The ballot initiative campaigns knew they had to appeal to Republicans as well as Democrats in order to win. That's just the math. And so in order to do that, they wanted to keep their distance. They didn't want it to be associated with the Democratic Party or Democratic candidates, because that would undermine their goal of getting these passed and getting these protections on the books. And so they very carefully said, hey, Democrats, stay away from us. You could hamper our ability to win. Now, that's at cross purposes with the Democratic Party, which wanted to bring these ballot initiatives and say, we are aligned. This is us. If you care about this issue, you need to vote for us. So when Kamala Harris took over the top of the ticket, abortion rights groups were so excited and said, finally, we have somebody who can speak forcefully on this issue, who can, not be, not be held back by, personal discomfort. Biden, famously used to be quite anti-abortion. Even after that policy evolution, he really was not comfortable talking about it. He often, wouldn't use the word abortion. And so there was real excitement around how Kamala Harris spoke about the issue. But when it came down to policy, what you said before is absolutely true. Both of their policies were restore Roe. It was exactly the same. It was not a more ambitious policy agenda, even though it was a much more forceful articulation of it. And so there are some groups on the left who feel like that was really a disadvantage and they missed an opportunity to really call for something way more expansive in terms of removing restrictions on abortion throughout pregnancy, which, it's always easy in hindsight to say that would have helped. Of course, that could have energized some groups and turned off others. But it's one of the reactions I'm hearing.
How much on the pro-choice side are you hearing about the framing of Donald Trump? Because one of the things that I noticed just looking at the kind of X's and O's of the campaign is that from the Republican perspective, and especially when I'm at like the Republican National Convention, you've got a lot of pro-life people that were upset with him. You have a lot of pro-life people that were talking openly about not voting for him because he was positioning himself to them as a moderate, and yet on the Democratic side, this was Handmaid's Tale. This was a theocracy that was going to come in. It struck me as interesting that there was really no common ground. This was not a conversation of, hey, these are things that are going to happen, that both sides agreed at least were stakes here. Do you think that, or what are you hearing from the pro-choice side about whether or not dealing with Trump as more of a moderate that had meaningful different policy perspectives? How did that play out?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it sort of gets back to where are people getting their information. So there is a real concern on the pro-abortion rights side that Donald Trump and his allies were successful in convincing people that they were moderates on this issue, that they wouldn't pursue national restrictions. And also there was a lot of sort of confusion and, sort of a misplaced understanding of who was responsible for what. There was polling that showed that a good chunk of the public thought that Biden was responsible for the fall of Roe versus Wade because it happened while he was president. I mean, yeah. It makes sense if you're a low information voter, you don't, read the news every day, and this happened on Biden's watch, theoretically, even though it was engineered years in advance by the right and by Donald Trump and his Supreme Court appointees. It makes sense that didn't necessarily click for folks. And so you're right. You had Republicans out there saying, I'm going to leave this to the states. We're not interested in a national ban. We support exceptions, yada, yada, yada. And you're right. The pro-abortion rights groups were saying, he's lying. He will do a national ban. And we sort of see that the messaging from the Republicans on that front seemed to have prevailed, at least with the swing voters in question.
Yeah. And it's hard to kind of quantify a lot of the stuff in the Trump era and to quantify him as a candidate. It's, both true that he is the guy that did the thing that every pro-life candidate said and wished that they would do, put enough justices on the Supreme Court to overturn that precedent. And it is also true to say that he's probably, at least the Republican Party on the primary debate stage, there were three candidates that called for national bans and they were all out of it within the first, few weeks of, those post debates, and Donald Trump was not one. So I guess here's the big question. Where do they go from here? Is there, or is this like so many liberal causes that everybody's in the lab for the next 2 years to find candidates that might put voice to some of these concerns?
Yeah, I think definitely folks are in the lab. I think that, um, on the advocacy side, there's just going to be a real shift into defense mode. And they're going to try to defend these protections at the state and federal level through lawsuits, through the executive branch regulatory processes, however they can. And in terms of what Trump will do, it's a real unknown because, like you said, he did campaign on this promise to leave it to the states, which the Democrats didn't believe at all and insist was just something to say on the campaign trail to calm down folks' fears. I think it's been pretty clear that this is not something Donald Trump is very personally invested in, but there is a real possibility that he could appoint people to key positions in the administration who are very zealous about this and will use the levers of the government to, maybe not ban abortion nationwide, but really make it a lot less accessible for a lot of people. There are so many ways they could do that. They don't have to go through Congress. And so that remains a real live possibility. And whether voters see that as going back on Trump's campaign trail promises, remains to be seen.
Well, it's probably up to those groups to highlight that, especially if they want to make it a wedge issue going forward. But I do wonder whether or not just the days of this issue being the monolith that it was, the motivating factor for money, for turnout, and for political identity, part of me thinks that crystal is just cracked and there's no going back to what it was 8 years ago. There's no going back to what it was 12 years ago. Certainly on a state-by-state basis, I believe it's going to be very potent. I think it's going to be potent here. I'm talking to you from Austin, Texas. I think it's going to be potent to some states, especially in the purpling South. But other than that, I don't know if it moves in the same way. When we look at one of those states was Nevada and Arizona that voted for Donald Trump in a big way and also approve those bans. I think that this is just going to be a nuanced issue going forward.
I completely agree. And I think, there were signs of that leading up to the election if you knew where to look. People, like I said, told pollsters that they agreed much more with the Democratic position on abortion, but they ranked it pretty far down on their list of priorities below the economy. And, as some sources put it to me, you might have an abortion, maybe once, maybe twice in your life, but you need to buy groceries all the time. You need to pay your rent all the time. And so what is going to take precedence in how you make your vote? It's going to be those sort of constant fears, and the fears on abortion, while real, may seem, more remote and less of a priority for folks. And so I think, there have been attempts by some Democrats, I'm thinking of Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, to really tie those issues together and say that abortion is an economic issue and really make that case. But I don't think that's been the overwhelming message. And so whether they lean more into that going forward or they try other tactics, I think, they're kind of at a loss right now on how to move forward.
To go back to what you said a little bit earlier when it came to the referendums, it is probably the story right there to say that the statewide referendums looked at the Democratic Party and said, hey, stay away. We don't want we don't want your brand next to what we think is a winning political issue. When the Democrats can't own abortion, what is the state of the party? What are you talking about?
Yeah. And what's really fascinating and confounding to some folks is that the main message of the ballot initiatives, which was successful in most places, the Democratic candidates were echoing those same messages in terms of framing it as a freedom from government interference in your personal life, which is a very conservative friendly message designed to appeal to conservatives as well as progressives. And, yet despite having that very same message and sort of rowing in the same direction, voters completely split because of Democrats' brand being compromised on unrelated issues.
And I guess that is the live by the intersectional sword and die by the intersectional sword, I guess, issue that the Democrats are going to have to deal with going forward as they pick through this, including many other things. One last question here, and then I'll get you out of here. What is the psychic toll of believing, as many Democrats believed, and I'm sure that the advocacy groups were probably the biggest true believers of it, that this was going to be the Rose sends her regards election. This was going to be the women voting with a wink and a nod to each other, no matter what their husbands might say. And for that to not be true, all political contests eventually come with some sobering realities. But has this been disorienting?
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, when I spoke to people, it was still a fresh wound. And so
yeah,
I think definitely worth continuing to revisit and seeing, what insights people maybe come to once the shock has faded away. But yes, across the board, from the elected officials I spoke to the leaders of some of these major groups that poured millions and millions into these races, just a real feeling of confusion and a feeling like they don't know the electorate, like, saying we told the public that these bans are causing widespread harm, they're even killing some people, and yet it just didn't seem to resonate. And so there's a real wrestling going on right now of why that is and how to get through to people in the future.
I think it's one thing to lose an election. It's another thing to lose an election that you think is going to be a 50-50 affair. It's yet another one to lose an election that you think you have a very steep advantage on. And you've seen previous to this in the special elections and the referendums that this was going to be a winner, only for it to come up short. But yet that is the world we live in, and it makes a little bit more sense thanks to the reporting of Alice Miranda Ollstein of Politico. Great job on that, and thank you very much for coming on the program.
Yes, thanks for having me.
I'd like to welcome back to the show one of my favorite reads on Substack, where we now find ourselves home, and that is Ettingermentum. Welcome back to the show, buddy.
Yeah, hi, it's good to be on. I think I was on a couple months ago. If you guys probably know me because I was one of the more bullish people on Democrats this election. That was not my kind of beat for the longest time, but I kind of got on that bandwagon on that take at the end, but that wasn't all that I said. So
no. And the reason why I very much appreciate your writing is that you do two things that I think are kind of essential, for which in a world in which we're not just reading 4 or 5 different outlets where the people that are there are kind of raised to a class. When we're in the kind of more Wild West blog style era, which is what I like, and I think Substack is very much brought back, I need 2 things. Take spelled out boldly with reason, and then if they're right or wrong, explain what went right and what went wrong. I appreciated that from you on both sides, because every time that you made a point, you didn't shy away from what evidence you were citing to make it. Some of the stuff you were right on, some of the stuff you were wrong on, and you came out and said, hey, look, here's where my priors were. I spelled them out the entire time. Oops. Here's what I'm going to think about going forward. What lessons have you learned from the 2024 coverage?
Yeah, well, the big thing, and one of the things I was hoping would be kind of something we could learn from this cycle, because it was something we learned in 2022, was that hopefully there could be a new way to follow elections by tracking these pre-election indicators that had historically been very predictive, but hadn't really received much coverage. If you follow the 2022 elections, if you only looked at polling, a lot of which came from like not very trustworthy outlets. A lot of people, and this is including like people who like traded stocks and wrote like news, like professional people like who like have a lot of money on the line for this stuff. They followed like these kind of simplistic narratives when there were like a lot of these like historically accurate or historically reliable like kind of tea leaves that you could look at, and that proved to be very useful in 2022. In 2024, those it also seemed to be telling a similar story. A lot of the pre-election indicators that were very useful like 2 years before then showed a relatively positive story for Democrats, but it didn't end up coming to pass in the same way that it did in 2022, specifically at the presidential level. I think it's a bit more of a mixed story at the congressional level. I think, like, because across the board, the results for Democrats were broadly, at the Senate level and in statewide races, were broadly kind of similar to what happened 2 years ago. They won most of the swing state, like Senate races. They only lost one seat, like how they lost Wisconsin in 2022. They lost Pennsylvania this year, although that was with an incumbent, so it was a bit more embarrassing than Barnes failing to beat.
If you don't count like Montana or whatever.
And they had overperformances in red states where they ran kind of locally strong, like how Tim Ryan did well that year. And at the House level, they had nearly an identical result, like it across the board. They actually gained 2 seats, I think. But at the presidential level, you saw this very different kind of environment. And this, because I would say, like, and this is kind of the main thing Democrats, I think, need to learn from this, like, speaking as somebody who's much more on the left than I think most of the party is, it would be convenient for me to say that this was a very, like, thorough rejection of, like, a centrist like, a centrist party and, like, these politicians who I don't necessarily like. But there was, like, a lot, like, the party did hold ground, like, kind of, like, remarkably well given the circumstances with, like, everything that happened, like, over the past 4 years for the party. But at the presidential level, things were consistently always very different. It was never clear, like when Joe Biden was in the race, that he could match what a generic Democrat could be, like as demonstrated in Senate polling and potentially in like these like low-level elections. My kind of, just to go back to like what my kind of perspective was, I was initially worried that he could, like as somebody who would prefer Republicans to lose, that he would not be a generic Democrat, that he was too old and too unpopular. As early as 2023, one of my first pieces that I wrote when I was still like very new to writing on Substack was saying, like before he announced his campaign, that I didn't think he should run for re-election. And that kind of concern like gradually would morph into like very strong alarm as his numbers failed to improve.
Deep panic.
Yeah, just like just budding catastrophe, because like my take on it was that his, like, for better or for worse, the people's perspective, their people's read of him, their understanding of him as a political figure was defined I don't want to say the vibes, because I hate the term vibes. I think it's like, it's a way to sort of infantilize like legitimate concerns that voters, or at least understandable concerns that voters can have and are pretty discernible and easy to explain and not like this nebulous concept. But I digress about that. That's just a pet peeve of mine. Biden's, like, kind of his story politically had always been, starting from when he first ran for the presidency, was that like it was about him as a figure less than him as like kind of a cipher for the party necessarily. He was always the more moderate figure. He ran on his experience, the idea of him as his elder statesman, and that succeeded in him allowing to outperform most Democrats in 2020. But once Afghanistan happens and inflation happens and his like public image like is like deteriorating,
people got to know him a little bit more, and not just see him next to Obama
or Trump, in contrast to Trump, or in his basement, like, in him just getting older. Like we saw like as early as 2021 that his approval rating, following the kind of trauma of the Afghanistan withdrawal, the humiliation of that, his approval rating never really responds to like these really big events. It's always consistently at like 40%, 38%. That like goes down sharply in like one moment in the summer of 2022, and it goes up back to 40% after he passes the IRA. but that's like basically all the movement you see, and that's despite like pretty major like socio-political, economic, like foreign policy events happening constantly throughout his tenure. His approval rating is never responding to things like the invasion of Ukraine or Dobbs or like inflation spiking or inflation eventually easing. And it like kind of painted a portrait of this White House that had this uniquely negative reputation. And this was something that the party like just refused to acknowledge. And I would say they, instead of like as part of refusing, there was no good reason not to acknowledge it. Like I guess there were like some theories at the time that like, oh, like Biden's a typically just a very typical president. They all have low unpopularity at the start of their like 30 year in office, and it'll improve gradually. But I think that all of those like kind of arguments work themselves backwards from this kind of inexplicable and emotional position that like he was just somebody who deserved it. They liked him. They thought personally that he was a good president and that he deserved better. And like it was very similar in a lot of ways to how the Hillary campaign in 2016 naturally never really made an effort to like improve their own favorables, because they assumed that like she was so awesome and that Trump was so bad that like she would just naturally become more popular and people would just move in line with what they thought was so obvious instead of actually doing anything to get that in line. It's this kind of like blinkered like tribalism that I think really got in the way of like the top of the party making like the responsible decisions, and that was enabled by, I would say, the like this new class of centrist thinkers who winnowed down what would like all that needed to be done to win in politics as a question of ideological positioning, which can have its place. I mean, like a lot of these people were just talking about like how like you need to like run ads that make you look good, which is hard to object to at all. But the larger story they were telling neglected these very fundamentally important questions that were like far more like important in defining like how people were planning to vote at the presidential level than like what Biden's stance was on like fracking or like natural gas exports or whatever those people were obsessing over. And they end up spending a year like gradually moving to the right over and over and over again as kind of this like coping mechanism to prevent themselves from actually like sitting down and saying like this just isn't tenable. Like they only reach that point when it's very, very late. They're like their backs are against the wall. There's surveys showing them losing in Virginia and like maybe New Jersey. They force them out after that. And then, like, when Kamala Harris comes in, she's facing an initial deficit, and she, like, kind of throws a lot of stuff against the wall. Then she improves her numbers, and they immediately become more cautious. Like, they prioritize, once again, kind of their own feelings above, like, really anything else.
Well, I think the biggest thing that is consistent between the two of them, and I would connect it back to the Hillary thing, is that for a centrist vision of the Democratic Party, boy, there sure is a lot of dogmatic adherence to whatever the message is. Yeah. And it's not really tolerant of a broader coalition. It's constantly vitriolic and angry about anybody who's not saying the exact same thing that they want to be said. And on one hand, you can understand that in their little bubbles and in the social bubbles that they exist in, everybody is slapping their head saying, wow, why are all these people getting in the way? They should just repeat the exact same words that we're saying. When at the end of the day, it's like, look, if you look at the turnout, you had depressed turnout with people who didn't see themselves in that campaign, and you spent the majority, I mean, you dispatched one of your best operatives, Liz Smith, to run RFK out of the party so he could literally run right across the street, and now he's in the Trump administration. And it's like, was the Kamala Harris count better for actively running those voters out of the party? I don't think so.
I would say, going back to your first point, I think this is really important. You're seeing a lot of like these kind of arguments in the aftermath of the election where people are saying that like actually like the like even though Kamala Harris ran like the campaign of their dreams, totally ran away from identitarian messaging, never talked about how she'd be the first female president like Hillary did, talked about having the most lethal military, like campaigned with Liz Cheney.
She has a Glock. She'd shoot somebody dead.
Yeah, the vice signaling. It was all like supposedly meant to like position her as ideologically more palatable to these voters. They played it by the book, and it didn't work, obviously. So the initial like kind of conclusion is, well, people's discontent with the party must run a bit deeper than like the fact that they aren't giving them these superficial messages. That's the obvious conclusion.
Yeah.
So these people, rather than kind of maybe like admit that they overclocked the importance of ideology or cultural signaling at the expense of things that were like probably a lot more important than that in this election, the response is to further like broaden the universe of what represents like intolerable wokeness. This is initially Democrats not condemning wokeness effectively enough. Like, this is what they said that Biden didn't do in 2020, and that's why he didn't win by as much as they said he should have. But what's funny about this, and this is something that I tracked in a recent article, if you look at like David Shore, who was an extremely influential consultant for the campaign, he was in a very leading role in like $1 billion PAC that ran a lot of Democratic spending at the presidential level for from July 2023 to the end of the election. If you look at like what he said in 2020 about defund the police during the specific period where Biden's numbers went up in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the protests and the riots were ongoing, Biden's numbers had gone from a 5-point lead to a 10-point lead during that summer, which is like something a lot of people have forgotten and was maybe just the result of just non-response bias and maybe nothing real. But at the time, it really did look like something that he and a lot of centrists predicted, that like this aggressive rhetoric on social justice would hurt the party, had the exact opposite effect. And it could have been a moment where like they kind of reconsidered their priors and said like, well, maybe these people actually succeeded in moving the conversation forward and changing people's minds. But he would use it as proof, like, no, it was effective because it gave Biden a window to disavow these actually very unpopular left-wing policies, which made him look more moderate than he did before, and that's why he was doing well. Then eventually, Biden only wins by 4.5 points. The narrative is that he underperformed, and the same exact guy, David Shore, talks about the same exact issue. What was once like helpful for Democrats because it gave them an opportunity to moderate on like this divisive issue was now this albatross that wounded them and killed them among like Latino voters and like low education voters, and like there was nothing they could do because even like the fact that somebody said it meant that these centrist politicians were totally helpless and they couldn't even just like disavowing it wouldn't even do anything. And it creates like this kind of like implicit demand that like not only does the party itself have to disavow these movements at every single opportunity, just reflexively, regardless of the kind of like possible benefits that like taking a more assertive stance could have down the line or in the immediate future. They're like insisting that groups that like don't like have that aren't directly involved in electing Democrats and may have far more different priorities or direct concerns also hew to centrist Democratic messaging, which is a level of message discipline which is just not even like remotely. There's no precedent for that. That's not like a thing that exists.
No, it doesn't happen, and it's also
right. It's not like the right doesn't have anybody saying nobody says crazy on the right. The exact no. It's
no.
That's not like a normal thing that a party does. Democrats aren't weird for being associated with people who have fringier or more left-wing views. Every party in the world is associated with people like that. That's just a fact of life. Like the idea, you're totally jumping the shark at that point. And there's the funny thing is that 2 years later, Shore again cast like defund the police as a because Fetterman wins this time when he was big on like criminal justice reform, and he said actually Fetterman used defund the police as an opportunity to moderate, and that's why he did well. So it goes from being an opportunity to moderate to an albatross that can't be moderated away from, to an opportunity to moderate 3 times in like 2 years, all based on like literally just what the results are.
It just comes back to me that, the modern Democratic Party, there are 3 guarantees: death, taxes, and we can fix this with messaging.
Yes.
Like it's just everything has to be this like min-max world of like, but if we say this thing, it's like, well, we're doing is just searching for the magic words. If we say the magic words, then everything will work. And it's like, no, candidate authenticity matters. And part of the thing that I think makes the aftermath of this, and I want to get to that in a second, with Kamala Harris so tricky to deal with, is that she was a wholly inauthentic candidate on both sides. When she ran as a super progressive in 2019, the progressives rejected her because they said, we didn't believe you. And then she ran as a centrist, and people were like, wait, well, we don't believe you now either. I don't really believe you own a clock. I don't believe any of this stuff that you're saying. I don't believe that you're really gal pals with Liz Cheney. And like that is a whole nother element of psychosis that I think needs to be dissected.
Yeah.
But like these things are bread and butter in politics. And yet for whatever reason, the sloganeering has become the main thing. It's like Obama wasn't Obama because of hope.
Yeah.
The slogan. He was Obama because of Obama.
Yeah.
And then hope came along with it.
It was a story. Yeah, he represented that. It's a great point. And I think what people like forget about Obama, who's been retconned in the minds of a lot of these people, as somebody who succeeded because he properly represented social moderation and conservatism on social issues, which is like an insane thing to say.
That's
about
not
the
true.
first black president who hemorrhaged support in ancestrally Democratic areas around the country. But whatever, that's what the story has been. He was also compared to Biden, Hillary, and Kamala, he was the only real outsider the Democrats have run really this century. He was the only meaningfully anti-war candidate. He was the only candidate who ran in opposition to a DC consensus as an outsider to a system that had screwed things up, instead of defending a system against allegations that it was screwing things up.
Yeah.
All of that is just basic things that should be understood as how politics works. There are big differences between it's understandable that people thought especially in the aftermath of Trump, polarization defines everything. There's no differences between individual candidates. It's all just this culture war signaling and median voter theory. But the thing is that Democrats have never really made an attempt at the top level, where people pay the most attention, to actually present a face of their party that doesn't play directly into Donald Trump's terms. Their past 3 nominees was Hillary Clinton, a 50-year Washington lifer, and Biden, and let's be honest, a very inexperienced, largely pretty untalented and just dishonest candidate in Kamala Harris, who the reason why people didn't trust her is that she's not trustworthy. She doesn't have.
There's nothing she has done. There's no moment that people are like, oh my God, I remember when. I was at the DNC. I'm in the room. I'm looking at people. I'm talking to people. There's no moment that they love Kamala and, oh my God, I can't believe we're here. Yeah. They're like, I'm very excited to have my first moment loving Kamala Harris here in this room. And it's like, okay, well, you're microwaving a candidacy, and I get it. But for all the waxing, at the beginning of this episode, I do a whole breakdown of the Pod Save America interview to just kind of go through where they were looking at things and just kind of trying to pull actual data.
That was very
amazing
helpful for the narrative.
Amazing. Yeah. But it's they say 7 times, because I clocked them 7 times, this is a 107-day campaign.
Yeah.
And
a lot of these people were in charge of the Biden campaign that ran for a year and a half before that.
Let's ignore that for a second, right?
Yeah.
But 107-day campaign. And then they talk about, wow, there was these crazy headwinds. Man, oh, geez, the people were liking Donald Trump more, and they really hated this administration. Those are crazy headwinds. It's no, those are things that you should know as a political professional you have to deal with. But also, look, I'm not a gigantic multi-million-dollar consultant. I'm just a guy with a podcast. But if you were to tell me I have 107 days and I have a really, really challenging environment, I don't know. I'd throw a lot of crazy shit at the walls.
Yeah.
I would say to the principal, you should resign from
Yeah.
the White House. Like
Yeah.
literally just, we need to do something to shake this up, because it doesn't benefit you to show up on the vice president's plane. It doesn't
Yeah.
benefit you to be tied to the administration. So maybe this all goes totally up in flames, but guess what? We're headed into the mountain anyway.
Yeah.
Let's actually act like we are down 30 points and start throwing on fourth down.
Yeah, exactly. It was like, it's hard to really like, there was that one tweet where they said that they were never leading, and that was, I got like a lot of views, like likes off of that, but it was slightly misphrased. Their point was that they never had led by as much as the public polls said. But like
Yes.
at that point, like you're really at a case where you're never really ahead, because like at most the public polls had her up by like 1 point in like Pennsylvania, which was always a tipping point state. It was never like a substantial lead. There were always like opportunities for her to have, like, she had a far more expansive map than Biden. I think that, like, given the information available in the highest quality polls, like you could have said that like even like every aggregator just said it was just a toss up. It was never like a situation where like they were totally like doomed. But like it at the same time, like it just comes back, like the one quote that I really like remember from that interview is like where there were two things. The one is the person saying that they were trying to break from Biden, like by telling a story that didn't point to any specific policy.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make any sense. And like, I don't like, why do you not need to point to a specific policy? Why is that something you don't want to do or can't do? I don't get why that's off.
Name a Democratic president that hasn't run on a thing. The one thing, the program they are going to fix, the program they are going to protect, the program they are going to invent. This is how Democrats do it. Republicans say they're going to tear things down. Democrats say they're going to build a thing.
Yeah.
That's the way it works. And instead they painted themselves into this world where they were like, no, we want to be Nikki Haley voters without the tax breaks.
Yeah,
we want to appeal to rich suburbanites, but we will make you spend more money. That's a brilliant idea.
Yeah, not to go too far off track, like once again, because we're getting to a lot of things here. But I will say with the Nikki Haley thing, like a huge part of this, a very overlooked part of this, and something I really want to hit on, like soon and over the next coming months, because it's not something many people are talking about outside of like Jacobin or whatever, is that, and respect to Jacobin, like that's not a shade to them. It's just like, it's kind of a marginalized perspective. Foreign policy was a huge issue in terms of how Biden was defined. People say foreign policy doesn't matter in elections, for like it's a low ranking issue. And that's true. But like, I mean, at the same time, like America's standing in the world is like a way that people judge presidents. It's something presidents have the most direct impact of. It's something that people obviously pay a lot of attention to, especially when you have two ongoing wars that the U.S. is regularly sending like multi-billion-dollar checks to. You can track a lot of Biden's, like, you can't track Biden's approval rating really rising and falling to like the way he, like his usage of Latinx or even inflation, but you can track his worst moments to like big foreign policy things.
Yes.
His approval rating collapses after Afghanistan. It goes down even further after the price shocks in 2022, a lot of which were the result of the Ukraine war, which they tried to pass off as Putin's price hike. Yeah. Awesome abandoned slogan up there with Bidenomics and like the annals of history. And then after October 7th in 2023, that is when Biden consistently starts trailing against Trump. He never regains the lead against Trump, but I think at any point following October 7th in between when he drops out. So you have like this presidency that is defined in large part by like the sense that like we elected this guy to be like this old detective coming in for one last job, like this old hand who
steady hand at the wheel.
Yeah,
and then you look up and Grandpa's asleep, and you're like,
exactly.
whoa.
That's exactly what it was. It was like there was a great Twitter thread by a friend of mine that it's like his public persona was a complete inversion of everything Americans expected their presidents to be, what they expected out of presidential power, and a lot of like a huge part of that, as much as inflation, even as much as his like just complete inability to communicate, was foreign policy. Like the sense that like these wars were continuing with no end in sight, no discernible kind of like goal or like way it would further U.S. interests, which is it's very ironic given that the whole basis of the administration was supposed to be making interventionism more palatable, and they never ended up succeeding in that. They made it worse. This gives Trump lane to really kind of reignite his 2016 branding as like this outsider candidate for peace. It allows him to be both things to all sides. He can promise like it's like a Nixonian thing where he gets the Hawks in line by saying that he'll like be tougher abroad, and then tries to appeal to Doves by saying that being tougher abroad will allow for peace deals, and that's his ultimate goal. It's like a classic kind of base cleavage thing that Republicans have done for decades. And like it really succeeded.
And it worked spectacularly.
Yeah.
It worked. It worked so well. He had record turnout with Jews, and he won the Muslim communities in Michigan. Like it was a symphony of cleavage.
Yeah, it was like if you look at the precinct level results, and part of this is like because everywhere shifted towards Trump at like nearly every single place in the country.
Except for Washington, and I want to get to that.
Yeah, Washington actually like moved to the right slightly in the final ballots, but it was the least right trending state in the entire country.
We'll just stop here because one of the things that you had mentioned earlier that was part of your coalition of indicators showing that this would be a Democrat-leaning electorate was the Washington primary, which showed anywhere from like a D1 to D3 result, depending on how you looked at it. Yeah. And that was...
It was very accurate for the state of Washington.
For Washington, which everywhere... That Washington... The New York Times map with all the crazy red arrows just like jagged shooting
and then Washington
rightward.
Was like boop.
One little tuft of blue hair coming out of Washington,
where it looked like the sole county that Kamala would like flipped from Trump 2020 to her that year would be in Washington. And that was like the moment where I was like, I just need to give up. Like God hates me or something. I don't know what I did wrong in a past life. But eventually, that county ended up flipping back to Trump, which makes Kamala Harris actually the first candidate since Herbert Hoover to not flip a single county from the previous election. Even like Walter Mondale and George McGovern had flipped counties in their landslide defeat.
Insane.
Yeah.
Insane.
But
so anyway, sorry. I think we were somewhere in the Washington primary. Let me ask you this. Here, we'll restart it because we just brushed on Trump.
Foreign policy, and Trump's like ability to kind of manage that. And this is like going back to like kind of the trend here of the party really prioritizing its own feelings over like really doing anything like making tough decisions. You like the foreign policy for the Biden administration is tremendously psychologically important to them. This is something that comes up time and time again in every biography or like telling of the administration and Biden personally. It's a huge part of like what made people start taking Biden seriously and transformed him from this like blowhard backbencher dipshit plagiarist that he was in the 80s to this like elder statesman figure who was like well received as Obama's VP pick in 2008. He sees himself as a foreign policy expert. He has this big chip on his shoulder because Obama largely ignored his, admittedly, like pretty correct advice in a lot of cases. During his presidency, he was ignored in pretty much every major decision. So he comes in like wanting to like establish himself as this great like kind of man of history who's like coming in at like this epochal moment that'll define generations, and he's going to reestablish America's power on the world stage. And like it's like the level of like kind of vaingloriousness gets really comical. There was one like really painful quote where he was bragging about how Kissinger had compared him to Napoleon on his deathbed, which just gets to like what like his priorities were. It was really just about like just this dick measuring contest, to be totally blunt. And the people surrounding him, his administration, who are like very loyal, longtime associates, people like Anthony Blinken worked in his office, like on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Sullivan, I think, worked for him like when he was vice president. You have these people who take it among themselves to respond to Trump by like Trump's like America First agenda, not by kind of they would kind of concede to it in some senses, but they would never like it would all be in the aim of propping up the idea of America as this internationalist, interventionist power that they felt it needed to be above all else.
Yeah.
So this, like, you get into this, like, this campaign where foreign policy, despite being this very unpopular issue for Biden, his approval rating on Israel, I think, is like below 30% at some point when
Yeah.
he's running for re-election.
Nobody likes it at all
Yeah.
whatsoever on any side of it.
Yeah, and it plays directly into these visions of him as an elitist and out of touch and like even a warmonger and like, but they aren't willing to give this up. They're willing to give up immigration. They're willing to give up the public option, which like they haven't mentioned since like I think that the last time Joe Biden has ever mentioned the public option was when he was president-elect in December of 2020.
Yeah.
They're willing to give up like practically everything imaginable, like any talk about like I don't know if police reform would have been popular or not, but like they don't talk about that anymore. Like they are trying to like they go on like all these local like podcasts as their media outreach strategy and like radio shows. Like they're willing to like throw everything at the wall, like except on like these issues that they personally care about. One of them being that they think Joe Biden is a great guy who's getting a raw deal and people are being very unfair and nasty to him.
Yeah.
And the other being like the sanctity. They literally use like religious terms when describing this. I think a colonel, like the guy who founded the Quincy Institute had a great article on this in 2022 where like he tracked how like the outright like the religious language that Biden would talk about like were like involvements, like he used sacred alliances and like sanctified commitments. It was like very emotionally charged, and this was something they were never willing to give up on. There was never like an effort to create a time plan for like ending the war in Ukraine, and the way that Trump like repeatedly pressed that he was going to get that over with and like decrease costs and like reduce the risk of nuclear war. That was just presented by the administration and the campaign, and later Kamala Harris as something like just obviously worth defending, like because it was the cause, which like may have been obvious for them and their people, but wasn't really clear to Americans. I think we're now at a point where a majority of people outright oppose sending money to Ukraine.
Yeah,
So,
because
like,
they don't see a point in it. They
Yeah.
they don't understand it. Aside from the general sense of like, okay, well, Putin's Hitler, like, okay, well, we need to stop him. This is not right.
Yeah.
It's like I think base level people agree with it, but it's like when
Yeah,
they're
it's not-
pissed off
it's
about
not-
their prices, they're like, wait, why? Wait,
Yeah,
how
it
much?
feels like a waste of money. It's like Obama's like line during his campaign and throughout his presidency was the only regime building I'm interested in. The only like nation building I'm interested in is here at home. That was like his
Boom.
line, and that's a great popularist line. It's a great
Yeah.
line to use against people like say Donald Trump, who are like who's like operation is staffed to the gills with these very far right like ex neocon figures. For as much as like they try to deny it and play both sides, like look at his cabinet. Like it's like people who supported every intervention under the sun. Marco Rubio literally ran under like the slogan "A New American Century."
Yeah.
Like this is like not a hard like kind of point to make even against someone like Trump. And it was something they sort of actually kind of pushed on him in 2020 that like they're like the Democratic platform, them it had all this about Russia and how Trump was kowtowing to dictators and all that bravado that like won over like Weekly Standard contributors and nobody else. But it
All
also,
dozens of them, as we found out.
Yeah, dozens. Yeah. But it also did win over, like, they also pushed on things like still opposing torture, like closing Guantanamo Bay might have still been a promise. I'm not totally sure about that. I think it was. And like saying that Trump had like been reckless and tried to start a war with Iran. The idea of like Biden was obviously a historically hawkish politician. He made no secret that like he had an ambitious like role, he had an ambitious idea of America's role in the world, that he wasn't exactly some like reformer in that sense. But there wasn't like the degree of daylight between the idea of him as this person committed to these countless operations overseas and Trump as somebody who was the guy in charge when things were relatively peaceful. Like that didn't exist in 2020, and it was a very strong contrast in 2024. And I can imagine that it was very appealing to the traditionally Democratic voters who either didn't vote in this election or just crossed over to Trump, often while voting for Democrats at the down ballot level who weren't as married to these, like the generally sense of how out of touch the administration was, and like these like overseas conflicts in particular. So the question here is not really like why, I like more than anything else, is two things. Why, like the first is why Democrats were scared to break from Biden, demand that he not run, when they eventually get him out, say that they disavow some of his positions, try to have some meaningful daylight from him, try to tell a story that they're different, that does actually connect to real tangible policies that matter to people, and not just vague vibes about how you're going on Oprah. I use the word vibes there, but that was really like the only way you could describe what they were doing.
Or just these memes that are like completely created, invented, and written within the Democratic, universe, where it's like you look back at it and like the coconut stuff was largely, to my knowledge, looking at it, it was started from the left, from the idea of like anyone but Biden will take this.
Yeah, that was
lady.
the whole joke. I had the emojis there that like got adopted by everybody like back in February because I was so despondent after the Her report. I was like, I wrote like this. I wrote the article like saying that he should drop out and that even she would be better on the day that he gave that State of the Union that would be the high water mark of like the ideas that he would do well. That even led Ezra Klein to kind of like disavow his own call for Biden to drop out. There was some real hostility there. You can look back at like my old article for The Nation that came out in the aftermath of that where I said that Biden shouldn't run. People were ferocious about that. They thought I was an idiot. But the question is why they were so eager to compromise on all these these messaging areas, these signaling areas, these actual policy areas like immigration wouldn't allow them to run to the right, while simultaneously avoiding these ultimately far less consequential breaks from an unpopular president that really would have been no skin off his back or anybody's back and may have actually made a real difference. The second one is why they were so protective of a very unpopular and foreign policy agenda that was just as, if not more, unpopular than their positions on all the issues that they compromised on. The selectivity in terms of how they dealt with Biden personally, how they dealt with his administration, and how they dealt with the initiatives that they personally agreed with is very, very striking. And it leads you into a number of directions. It leads you to think maybe they should have just been more consistent in popularism instead of just doing these half measures. But I think that even coming to that conclusion still misses the mark more broadly, because the symptom here is the idea that everything in politics, and I call this sort of like a bedtime story because it's an incredibly relieving and comforting illusion, or fiction, a convenient fiction to have, that it's always, everybody just wants to believe that their only problem is bad messaging. That's the best problem you can ever have as a political party. Because if your problem is bad messaging, you don't need to make any hard decisions. You just need to get better at branding.
Yeah, and it's also the dumbest thing, because guess what a good candidate does? Make messaging really easy. Because they're well-defined, they're well-liked. Just find a thing, a thing that they do, name their car, and say, I'm a car guy, or whatever. That's all there is. I want to ask you this question, because baked into everything that you've said, and into a lot of your writing when you saw lanes that Biden could overperform, that the Kamala Harris campaign wasn't a toss-up, that she was leading, is baked into one very simple idea, that Donald Trump is a uniquely toxic and unpopular candidate. And I wonder now where you look at that proposition.
Yeah, well, I was at the point, and I think I kind of after the 2022 midterms, I was very much at my understanding of it, because his favorables were very low, and it was kind of a humiliation. He was so tightly associated with these candidates who had done so poorly. I was kind of the belief that he was kind of damaged goods. That becomes I kind of stuck to that. That becomes a little kind of trickier to believe when you see him outrunning the
heat ray everybody within seconds of the primary.
Yeah, well, not just the primary, but when you have the Senate polls coming out, you have him outrunning these Senate candidates, and so the question there is, well, is it the case that Donald Trump, the most consistently toxic figure in American politics, whose party has lost every election since 2016 when he barely won, has he just become this uniquely popular figure, or has is Biden just too old, and are there reasons that somebody who would otherwise vote for Democrats would vote for Trump over him? And I thought the obvious conclusion to that was that it was a Biden problem, and that ended up being right in a lot of ways. I mean, the fact that Kamala Harris saw the surge that she did, just through the fact that she, just by virtue of her being like a different person than Biden, I think reflects that a lot of it really wasn't Trump's own strengths that had put him in such a strong position, but. And like you could still make an argument that she was a very flawed candidate, and like the fact that she hadn't like broken from Biden, like put her in the same problem, and like ultimately made her a worse candidate than like the rest of the party, which I think is like true in a lot of ways. We did see her underrun like nearly every single Senate Democrat in the country.
Yeah,
like the congressional races were a bit more mixed, but she underran most of the frontline members in the House, like that won all those swing district seats. There were quite a number of like Trump district Democrats who will be going to the House next year. I think that if like Republicans won, like there are like nearly 15 members of Trump district Democrats like who won their elections, which is not very typical. It's a very kind of tricky thing to split, because you're trying to like you're looking at, it's kind of like a stoppable force versus a movable object in a lot of ways, like where you have Biden's unstoppable force versus an immovable object. I was trying to use a reverse analogy here, but like the original one actually works better, I think, where it's just like the force of like the negative impact of Biden's administration and Kamala Harris's inability to break from that collides against Trump's historic trend of just consistently underperforming, and his like the candidates who are associated with him consistently underperforming. By the end of the election, I wrote like this long piece, and it's one of like the few pieces from the end of the election that I think still holds up pretty well. Like that was mostly about the death of like Trumpism without Trump as like the dream that like
Yes.
Trump was this albatross for the party, and that like any like you could run like some random guy off the street with his position and he'd do better. And a lot of that touched on like something that I had kind of noticed, and like something that like I like thought explained like the reason why Trump was doing better than the Kerry Lakes of the world, was that Trump in 2024 was an experienced candidate in the way that he was
Yes.
in 2016. He had spent 4 years in the White House. Polling indicated that Americans in retrospect were largely okay with his record then, like for like even though they weren't at the time. People like there wasn't the question like of like the devil you don't know. Like there was in 2016, there wasn't the question that like the wheels could totally fall off the bus in the way that people feared that they could if he won in 2016, and like the polarization of him like just defining the Republican Party, like bringing him like closer to like that like very base level of Republican support instead of like in the mid 30s like he was when he first ran. And that makes him, I think, a lot more credible of a candidate than a lot of the wannabes, like whether they be like Kerry Lake or even like Ron DeSantis, who did actually underperform Trump in polling by the time he left the race nationally. Like the question of experience there is a very real thing, and I think that was a benefit that Trump did have relative to the rest of the party. If that was the question, is I'm not so certain if that was like enough, like that, like it would have totally muted any of like possibly good Democratic campaign. I think.
Oh, yeah.
Like Trump's history of underperforming like makes it like I think that it's plausible that we could have seen a world where he ran like far more in line with the rest of his party, or like even did slightly worse than other candidates of his party, like he did in most of his past two elections. But that was never going to happen with a Democratic campaign that played entirely into his strengths.
Well, and also if you don't acknowledge that he can be popular,
Yeah.
then you cannot craft a message to pry people away.
Yeah,
you're
or
going
even-
to
At
like
least
you're-
relative to like Bidenism, that he can be popular.
Yeah, I mean, this is the way that I've kind of come to understand this race is that this was not unwinnable for Democrats.
Yeah.
But it was unwinnable for the Democratic Party as it existed. Because the Democratic Party,
I think
as
that's a fair conclusion.
they were just never going to believe that they could lose to Donald Trump if they just repeated over and over and over, Donald Trump's a terrible person.
Yeah.
And that's can't be your lead message. It simply can't. You need to offer something that people believe in, that is consistent with the branding of Democratic politics. It wasn't going to happen with those candidates, and it wasn't going to happen with those messaging. And the one thing that I would say going forward for the Democratic Party and like the apparatuses that surround it is the echo chamber gaslighting of like everybody just needs to get on the same hymnal sheet is really damaging. Like you need to understand this is a broad coalition. You got a lot of different people. The most successful times is when a centrist has taken progressive ideas and been able to explain it in a way that makes sense to swing voters. That to me has been the most historically relevant way that you can get to the White House. But if all you do is demand centrist orthodoxy and then complain when progressives are too mean to you, then you're just cutting off your nose to spite your face, unless you're dealing with a once in a century pandemic. Yeah, you're playing. Well, I would say like the pandemic. There's actually some reasons to think that it did help Trump, but that's like a story for another day. I would agree with that. I think it's like in the aftermath of a party that like went through with what could only be called a historically disastrous decision, and getting behind Biden's decision to run, whether or not that could have been prevented or not with a greater effort, is no excuse for the fact that no greater effort was made beyond Dean Phillips launching his campaign. Like the fact that clearly came from like a culture of groupthink and rigidity and like just like terror, scared of their own shadow. That's everyone's just so scared that they're not going to get a job again. Yeah, wishful thinking and self-indulgence. Like that is clearly the largest problem that the party has right now. And the idea that like stability is like the most important thing above anything else, and that like you have to follow everything by the books, whether it be like, oh, we can't have an open convention or a primary because like historically that hasn't been what's been the best idea. We can't break from Joe Biden because historically that hasn't been what vice presidents do. Like the rigidity of the thinking is very clearly what caused them this awful result. So if the idea is like that you need to like win, like bring back Rahm Emanuel and get every single Democrat to like follow this like hostage video type message where you like only like parrot talking points approved by slow boring, to put it lightly, you need to wonder if like you're saying this because like it's a real response to the results as they actually exist, or if it's just like what you would like to see happen personally as a centrist. I mean, the Rahm Emanuel thing is insane to me. The idea that the person who has never been popular by the end of his job at any job he's had on the national level. He got ran out of the Obama administration. He got ran out of Chicago. And the only reason why we think he didn't screw things up as ambassador to Japan is that most Americans can't say, what the f is this guy's deal in Japanese? Like that's the concept that he's the healing balm for a new generation of the DNC is ridiculous. Because he like chaired the DCCC like after Hurricane Katrina. Like that was a real tough election, man. that was like really like you were really in the fuck. That was like crazy headwinds, like with the Iraq War and Bush at 30% approval. The end of a lame duck term, a two-term Republican president. Security privatization. He pulled a rabbit out of the hat. Notice how they never bring up his time as mayor of Chicago in any of those like articles. Like they never have much to say. It's like, and that was a horror show by the end of it. Now, granted, it's not like we've had a lot of famously, popular mayors of Chicago in recent years. But that being said, still on his record, and his whole idea was that he was the guy who could fix it. Yeah, and like his whole thing was like who was it that he tried to wrestle naked in the steam room or whatever, like when he was in the Obama administration, like. Just a unique dude that's only gotten even weirder. And if his brother wasn't Ari from Entourage, I don't even know if we'd still be talking about him. Oh, his brother was like an Entourage? No, well, his brother Ari Emanuel is the inspiration for the character I didn't know Ari from Entourage. Yeah, so like, awesome. That's if it weren't for like that he was the real Ari from Entourage, who was also Dana White's boss, which I can only imagine what those Christmas parties are. But yeah, anyway, I digress. Rahm Emanuel's an idiot. And if the Democrats give any kind of about trying to expand the base of their party and understanding that they got to come to some understanding with the progressive left, like, and just shaming the activists. And look, there can be a good conversation about the roles that activists have played in the discourse and whether or not things have gotten, out of whack there. But to me,
They
the point
weren't put in charge of billion-dollar PACs. That's all.
Well, exactly. That's the other thing is it's like, okay, so you're going to go, let's totally fritter around the idea that $4 billion was spent on this election and it has shown bubkiss, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing to show for it.
Yeah, you guys who are actually like in positions of tremendous influence get a mulligan on this for no reason, while like people like who said something like relatively controversial in 2019, like you're the her, like on American politics for like as long as you live and everything's your fault in perpetuity.
Yeah, but meanwhile, the ding dongs who spent $1.5 billion so you could test the future forward thing, where it's like they just say with impunity. And I think, by the way, that Pod Save America thing, they're going to throw Future Forward under the bus. All these books are going to shred Future Forward.
They're already releasing private polling. It's like there's no loyalty. I will a really good point about that whole like kind of like David Shore kind of way of like deigning what's acceptable or not. Messaging testing is probably good if you want to run good ads, but messages can only be tested against other messages. They can't be tested against the same message or a different message in a different context with a different candidate under different circumstances after like certain amounts of time, like pushing forward an agenda that resonates with people or a narrative that supports said message. It only like is able to show what's popular in the moment, and like that's just very limited. And I don't think that like the conclusion you come from the fact that like X or Y message, according to one kind of methodologically like unclear like polling thing, which even like Democrats complained about how like the lack of transparency with how they conduct their like scoring regimen because it was like so influential. Like that's not the end all be all for everything. Like a message that like doesn't land with Joe Biden may very well land with a different candidate, like with a more compelling message, somebody who isn't seen as politically spent or dishonest or inauthentic. Like you can get away and like push a lot different stuff and change the conversation in different ways, like by being a bit more imaginative than just like taking the same status quo for granted and trying to tweak it on the margins. Like I don't think that's a holistic vision of politics. And the idea that it ever was just something that was a convenient fiction for people who didn't want to make real changes that could have hurt their feelings.
Well, and we're just scared. It's a constant terror of but what if, and you can tell even that Pod Save America thing. They did that interview because they're scared of other liberals shredding them. Right? Mm-hmm. They're scared. They're scared of you. They're scared of your Twitter. They're scared of narratives that are created on social media that get a lot of traction. And now they're like, gosh, call Pfeiffer. We got to go on Pod Save America so we can put out our version of it. Which it's like, it's so stupid. It is one of like when you've got that much gas in the tank, when you're dealing with that much money, when you can do literally whatever you want. The idea that you're scared of your shadow is, I think, the only thing that is unforgivable. And it should be disqualifying for the vast majority of the people that were on those campaigns and ran that, ran that race specifically, in my opinion.
Yeah. I just saw a news report that Biden's planning a preemptive pardons for Adam Schiff, Anthony Fauci, and Liz Cheney in light of Trump's threats. He should do a preemptive pardon for every single American citizen to stop Trump from using his power.
Is that for real?
Yeah. I just saw like a thing about that.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I never even thought about that idea. That's kind of interesting. It could get kind of wacky over the next, because it's not even like the pardon lobbying. It's preemptive pardon lobbying.
Well, and this is all right. So I mean, I shredded the Hunter Biden pardon.
He's going to do the self pardon. It's going to be awesome. He's going to resign and get Kamala to pardon him.
Yeah, it's the only reason why he's saying this now, and this is so indicative of the Biden administration, is that he has gotten the shit kicked out of him for pardoning his son for 10 years, right? That all goes right back to the Burisma stuff.
He's just a hack, liar, fraud.
And so he's doing this to cover that. There's no consistency.
Yeah.
This is just, it's jazz. It's like jazz on a poop saxophone.
Yeah, Yeah.
It just it doesn't. Oh my God! All right. Well, you want to know what? We're gonna have to bring you back on soon because we didn't even get to the Liz Cheney of it all.
Or
which
like
I,
any of the like the election indicators that I brought up.
any of the election indicators, any of the Civil War. We got a little bit on the Civil War of what's gonna happen.
Washington
But we'll,
voters, you me over. It's all your fault. You ruined me. I'll never forgive you. I'm never watching Twin Peaks again.
And again, and I just want to say this, and now that we've kind of been through this cycle and we're through the 4 years, I just want everybody to listen, and especially the center listeners and the right listeners that listen to this. You got to read people like Ettingermentum because there's not a whole lot of people that cite their sources, say their takes that are bold, and then actually take accountability for them.
Yeah.
Like it is rare in this world, and if you do that, to me, you're golden. It doesn't matter. Just do your research and then own up to it when you're wrong. That's it. That's all that matters in this world. Everybody else that just eats around the edges. No, maybe. No. If you're wrong, you're wrong. Take your credit for it. Take your lumps. Move on. Where can people find your work?
Yeah, Ettingermentum.news on Substack. I'm also on Twitter and Blue Sky, which is where everybody's going right now. So, and also Twitch. I'm planning on getting into that soon, hopefully.
Oh, you're streaming now.
Yeah. I've been doing it with my girlfriend the past couple months. So, and I did one right before the election, and I should probably do that. Try to diversify the content mill more.
Yeah. Dude, that's streaming life's a rough business.
I'm wary of it. It looks way scarier than article writing.
Article writing, Substack stuff is it's very, very comfortable. Very comfortable.
Yeah.
Very, very on your own schedule.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on.
And that wraps it up for us today and the week. Politics, written and hosted by me, Justin Robert Young. For Dog and Pony Show Audio here in Austin, Texas, send me any emails you'd like, theyoungamerican@gmail.com. Find, follow, and share video clips of the show. Justin R. Young on TikTok, Instagram, and X. YouTube, we're politics. We love the YouTube audience. Support us with a one-time donation. PayPal.me/PayJury. Venmo is Justin-Young-20. Cash App is PX3 Cash. You can send me anything you'd like in the mail. Post Office Box 153184, Austin, Texas 78715. Of course, you can always get our bonus content at TakePoliticsSeriously.com. Paying members get 2 bonus episodes each and every week, either $3 a week or $99 for the entire year. That's 150 episodes of PX3 for under $100. But our founding tier, get your name read at the end of the show like these fine folks in our founding Titanic tier, including L3PO, Peepaw, Scott, Middle-Aged Mike, Tom, Sarah Jeannie, Jeremy, Pro Idiot, Chiller Tomatoes. Oh yeah, it's Adam, Neil, AB Puppy, Dr. Whiskey, Michael, Fat Tony's PJs from New York, Will, The Borge B, Matthew, Matt, Andrew, Edwin, Sam, Andrew, Phil, Edison, Devon, Paul, a dog named Checkers, Gloria, my beautiful, talented, and smart mother, Jerry, Trucker, John, Berkeley, Stephen, and Zombie Doc, and you. If you head on over to TakePoliticsSeriously.com, sign up at our founding tier, get your name read on the show, and if you want to be one of our donor club, the people that get their name read at the beginning of the show, just go ahead and send me an email, theyoungamerican@gmail.com. Boy, howdy. We're going to get back in the lab in the weekend. We're going to have a great bunch of shows for you guys coming up. Till next time, this is your old pal, Justin Robert Young, saying some shows talk about politics, others talk about politics, still more discuss politics. This is the only show that dares discuss. Oh, 3.
Diamond Club hopes you have enjoyed this program.
Dog and Pony Show Audio.